All right. Well, thank you for your interest today in hearing us talk about measurement challenges when including adolescents in your research. I'm Kathy Vanatta, and we'll be trading off shortly with my co-presenter, Dr. Jamie Jackson. I wanted to start by reminding you about who we're here to discuss and why this period of life and research can be so challenging. When I ask my neighbors or extended family to define adolescence for me, they often focus on this being the group of kids that are teenage or high school students who experiment with limits, figure out who they are, or just become difficult to interact with. The Webster Dictionary provides a little bit more detail or a little bit different definition of this being the period of time following onset of puberty during which a young person develops magically from a child into an adult. Scientists tend to get a little bit more specific or process-oriented and focus on the different domains of change: biological, psychological, social change, and you'll see some examples there on the screen. Just really marked areas of development that are all happening simultaneously during this transition period from childhood to adulthood. And you'll notice that in those definitions so far, none of them have really attached this to a concrete age range. And believe me, I searched for that because I think it's kind of convenient to have a specific age range of 12 to 18 or 10 to 25. Those were the kind of ranges that you can find if you look out there for a chronological age definition of adolescence. And partly that's because it's inconsistent in different uses of the concept, but also because this is a definition of adolescence that's kind of arbitrary and has evolved over time and changes between different contexts. But you will hear people differentiate adolescence into early or late adolescence with a fair amount of inconsistency. Health researchers often use biological markers as a way to subdivide the adolescent period based on onset or stage of puberty that research participants, for example, are in. And other kinds of research, education, or actually epidemiology, like with the CDC, often focus on different role transitions that have or haven't happened, like whether kids are in middle school or high school. And within Western cultures, there's been a general widening of the period of adolescence. And partly this is because of our progression toward earlier and earlier onset of puberty, but also because of delayed role transitions that come after formal education. And many of you will have heard of the period known as emerging adulthood, which rather than stating adolescence being such a broad age range, for example, 10 to 25, that emerging adulthood is a label applied to legal adults who aren't socially done with the kinds of role transitions and assumption of responsibility we think of as being hallmarks of finally accepting that adult role. And these different definitions and so forth, I don't mean to spend so much time on them, really are relevant to conducting research with adolescents and measure selection. So why would you be thinking about including adolescents in your research? Some people are interested in a specific stage of adolescence because that's actually part of their topic. Others focus on specific transitions or transition periods like AYAs. But often I think we run into measurement challenges because someone is planning a longitudinal study that covers very diverse periods of development, and how do you find assessments that can handle those transitions? And in healthcare settings, I think we're often trying to include adolescents in research because we're primarily interested in a rare condition that we want to study in childhood or in adulthood, and we want to maximize our sample size by pulling adolescents into that cohort. So some of the measurement challenges that we can face are that there is variability in what content is relevant to assess for adolescents that may not match up well with children or adults that are going to be included in the same study. And so the indicators of that construct or the constructs themselves may not be consistent. The format of assessments that are appropriate for adolescents may also differ from older or younger populations in terms of the language that is used or the mode of assessment that are preferable for adolescents, as well as what their concerns might be about privacy in the research setting. Then getting down to nuts and bolts, as with any kind of measure selection challenge, we want to make sure that we're selecting measures that have evidence of reliability and validity for each age group that we're studying. And again, when we're primarily trying to work up from a child-oriented protocol or down from an adult protocol, the measures we want to use may or may not have established psychometrics or norms within the adolescent population. So I'm going to try to use a selection of cognitive assessments as a good example of these challenges. And one reason this is challenging for adolescents, this area of assessment, is because adolescence is a time of marked cognitive change. And in particular, adolescents are developing a lot of executive functioning skills over the course of what we might consider an adolescent period. And so the tests that we select have to be age appropriate for them. And that's not just appropriate in terms of there being norms and evidence that the measures should be reliable and valid for them, but also that the tests or the tasks that we ask them to do are suitably challenging, that a wide variety of adolescents will have their skills adequately tested with that device. And so we don't want to have a ceiling effect where it's just too easy of a task for adolescents to complete. And as you'll see in the examples I want to provide, tests you're trying to use across a broad age range or an area you want to assess across a broad age range may require tests that have age-specific versions, or that you're selecting them based on the aims of your particular study. So I'm going to talk about two kinds of cognitive assessments we might want to select for a study. And one is just if you're assessing global cognitive abilities, which sounds like a pretty straightforward thing. Maybe you want to get an IQ estimate or get some broad assessments of cognitive domains. And as you can just see, I'm not going to go through these test by test, but that different test systems, some of which may sound familiar to you, vary in whether they are appropriate for a very broad age range or a very narrow age range. And some systems, like the Wechsler system, will have different versions of the task that are pretty compatible with each other in the scores that they generate. But it is a separate test that you would administer in different age ranges. And there's some overlap between those age ranges. I'll pause for just a moment and let you take a look at that. The second slide that I prepared on this focuses more on different measures you might use for more specific cognitive functions. And I mentioned that executive functioning skills are an area of growth for adolescents. So these different tests kind of focus on that, and also gives us an opportunity to show you might be thinking about whether you want to use an assessment tool that is has some technology assistance or is a digital format like the NIH Toolbox, whether they're more traditional clinical assessments, which also would give you a chance to generate norm-based scores and offer some clinical interpretation of the data that you're collecting. I didn't fit it onto the slide, but there are a lot of different, very specific research-based measures or measures developed by researchers to assess executive functionings that often lack norms altogether in terms of allowing you to make that kind of clinical interpretation, but might be very well suited to the specific aspect of executive functioning you want to measure. And then finally, that there are survey-based measures like the brief of more behavioral manifestation of cognitive deficits that then you run into challenges of what source of information or age group that you're trying to assess. All right. And by the way, I wanted to put a plug in here that these types of measure selection questions are something that the biobehavioral outcomes core that's supported by CCTS at Nationwide often is involved in helping researchers do both selecting measures and conducting assessments. So now I'm going to transition over to my colleague, Dr. Jackson, who's going to talk more about additional measurement challenges, particularly with older adolescents in health behavior research.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Vanatta. So when thinking about the older adolescent, particularly within the realm of health behaviors, there's a few things that I want to kind of bring up just for some context before we start talking about other types of assessments that we might be interested in if we're including an adolescent population in our research. So given that the older adolescent is going through a period of emerging autonomy, in the realm of health behaviors, this has several implications. So for example, and this is an area that is particularly relevant to my own research, older adolescents have less emphasis on physical education in school. And so as a result, they may actually have less structured physical activity built into their day. High school tends to emphasize more optional sports, the operative word there being optional. And so again, this is a consideration when thinking about health behaviors for older adolescents. Could physical activity and change in physical activity, for example, from childhood to adolescence, be of interest? Also, older adolescents are making more independent food choices now, particularly when it comes to school. They're purchasing their own lunches. Oftentimes they can even leave campus and purchase lunch outside of there, coming home, eating a snack before parents get home. So there is just a lot more independence with what their food selection is during this period of time. And lastly, there's a really strong influence of friends during this developmental period, which I also think plays an important role when we're thinking about assessments, particularly if we're wanting to include parent report as part of our assessment process. Are parents watching and observing different aspects of their adolescents' behavior as much as potentially friends might be, as an example? So let's talk a little bit more about some types of assessments for health behaviors that we might be interested in. So one of those would be the classic self-report measures that we often will use to gauge various types of behaviors, including health behaviors. So one important consideration when thinking about adolescence is the modality by which you'd be administering these self-report assessments. Now we thankfully have more technology at our fingertips, and we can collect data even more easily, I would argue, using an online platform such as REDCap, which might be familiar to those of you who are listening right now. I certainly use REDCap a lot in my own research, and it has a lot of benefits to it, including reducing just burden on research staff for having to enter data, just as one example. Now, when you're thinking about administering online surveys to adolescents, you should consider the context in which an adolescent is going to be completing this online measure. So even with like a REDCap survey, it's probably likely that a teen is going to be completing this on a cell phone, and potentially not in the most quiet, distraction-free zone. And so given that, you want to take into consideration how long the survey is, not only in its entirety, but also within each page of the survey before they have to click next to go on to the next page, how much scrolling on a small device like a phone do you want that teenager to have to do? And again, distraction being something that you'd want to keep in mind. Also, I had just alluded to this a few minutes ago about whether or not you want to include multiple sources when you're thinking about collecting data with older adolescents. Do you want parents to be involved, just as an example? And, you know, I think especially for children, obviously parents' report of children's engagement in health behavior is really critical. When you're talking about an older adolescent, there may be a lot of behaviors, as I had mentioned, that are less observed by parents. So what type of source would you want to include? And is it relevant to include parents? And if you want to include another source, multiple sources, parents or potentially peers, making decisions about how you're going to handle that statistically for your analyses is important to think about a priori. And one of the other considerations that I think is also important for us with this older adolescent group is the validation of the assessment tools that you're going to be using for your age range of interest. And Dr. Venata had already talked about that with some of the cognitive assessments, but I would like to revisit this for a moment in thinking about some self-report assessments. So let's take the specific example of the construct of health-related quality of life, which is popular when we're considering health behaviors. So similarly to what Dr. Venata had shown with kind of the lifespan listed below, let's visit just a few common assessment tools and how this kind of stacks up with where they fall on the lifespan. So let's start with a common tool, the Pediatric Quality of Life Survey, also known as the PEDS-QL, which is validated for the ages of 5 to 17. So with the PEDS-QL, I would consider one of the positives of this measure is that you also can get along with it a valid parent report if you're interested in multiple sources. And so particularly, again, with children, it's helpful to be able to have a measure parent report to accompany the self-report you may be receiving on the children. However, when it comes to older adolescents who are completing the PEDS-QL, and again, we're talking about high school age, so 15 to 17, the questions that are asked are pretty much the same identical questions almost for younger children as what a teenager is going to be completing. And some of those questions just may not have as good a face validity for an older teen that's completing them, and they may think of them as less applicable to some of the elements of their life that they're encountering during that time frame. Now, on the flip side of that, let's think of another commonly used measure for health-related quality of life, which is the SF-36 or RAND-36. This is validated in adults 18 and older. The items that are on the SF-36, I think, are very relevant for even high schoolers. So again, I think the face validity works well with the SF-36. However, again, this is not an instrument that's designed to be used with an adolescent sample. You don't have the ability to get multiple reporters using the SF-36 like parent report. And if you use this within an older adolescent population and you attempt to publish it, as I have, you may get a little bit of pushback from viewers because it hasn't been validated in that younger age group. I will say, in my own research, the internal validity of this measure holds up well in an adolescent sample, but once again, this is not the intended age range that it's supposed to be used with. Now, we also have access to a measure called PROMIS that came from the NIH toolbox. Now, the PROMIS has been validated for self-report in ages starting at 8 all the way up through adulthood. So a positive of the PROMIS is that, not only does it have such a long applicability to a long lifespan, being from childhood all the way up through adulthood, you also have, for 17 and under, the ability to get parent report. Now, one of the possible downsides, and as you can see for face validity here, instead of a plus or a minus sign, I have a circle. And what I mean by that is the individual items on this measure for a high schooler are even more relevant than what I would consider the way the PEDS QL is worded. However, they still refer to teenagers as children in the measure. And so in my own research, I have had to replace that, or I felt the need to replace that with the word teen instead of using the word child. So there are, again, just considerations thinking about high schoolers, how some of these various measures will line up. So kind of coming back to this whole thought of an 18-year-old, as I had mentioned with the SF36, you know, when we're thinking about 18-year-olds, and I know Dr. Venata had raised this question too, that these are technically legally adults. They can consent for themselves to participate in research. However, I think many of us would consider an 18-year-old has a ways to go as far as their developmental trajectory before we can consider them an independent functioning adult. That being said, you have to kind of make a determination in your own research for an 18-year-old. Is that person going to receive the same questions that you would give a 16 or a 17-year-old? Or are they going to get questions that, for example, you would give a 21 or 22-year-old? Now, in my own research, we have, instead of thinking about this in a more chronological sense, we've thought about it in more of a developmental sense. So if I have an 18-year-old who is still in high school and who's living at home, I would give that individual the same items or questionnaires that I would give to, for example, a 16 or 17-year-old. Now, if that 18-year-old has moved out of the home, is no longer in high school, is living independently, maybe even working, that 18-year-old seems to be serving or functioning essentially much closer to maybe a 21-year-old is. And so then I would give that individual what I would call the adult measures in my study. And, you know, I think in thinking about the measures I had just shown you, it's also important for us to consider whether or not there's the potential and possibility that you would be looking at longitudinal data collection and including those older adolescents in that longitudinal follow-up. And if that's the case, you're really going to want to think and pick and choose which of those measures is going to make the most sense to follow that sample over time. So given that we've got limited time today, I would love to talk a lot more about various objective measurements of health behaviors, which is something else that is often included in health behavior research. But today I'm going to focus in particular on physical activity, which is something that I use a lot in my own research. And one of the gold standards for measuring physical activity is the use of an accelerometer. And in my lab, we use the device called an actigraph. That accelerometer, which is pictured on the lower left-hand corner of the screen, is kind of what looks like a small red pedometer that is worn with an elastic band around the waist, and it sits on top of the hip, and the device itself has to be oriented in a particular direction. And we ask that the participants wear this device for 12 hours a day for 7 days, which you can imagine is not that exciting to a teenager. But nonetheless, we have a lot of success using this, this objective measurement of physical activity, but I do think it would be helpful to bring up a couple of the challenges that we have encountered and are considerations for you as well if you were to include such a measure. So because parents are not as involved in the teens' day-to-day activities, including they're not getting their teen dressed in the morning, teens are doing that themselves, remembering to actually put the device on, wear it, and return it to us can be a bit of a challenge. You know, of course, we do a lot of text text reminders and things like that for our adolescents to try to help them remember. We also use a cloud-based platform that comes along, you can purchase along with the Actigraph system that will, if a participant actually uploads their data using their phone, then we can actually tell whether or not the device is being worn. But once again, it requires that participant to remember to even upload it. So there are a lot of reminders that have to happen. There's also limitations as to what activities can be assessed with the accelerometer. They can't be worn in the swimming pool. If a participant is bicycling with the device, then it might not pick up on that activity very well, and they can't be really used very well in contact sports such as football. So once again, just thinking about why are you measuring physical activity and in what age group may determine whether or not this is the device for you, or even the type of objective measurement that you would like to use. And then lastly, and we found this particularly challenging with this device, is processing the data once that data is collected in the device. So with the Actigraph devices, you can use their software, Act2Life, in order to essentially pull that data and have it labeled as either sedentary, light, moderate, or vigorous levels of physical activity. And to do that, the software will ask you to select an algorithm which has been validated in either children or adults. There are no algorithms that are validated for older adolescents. And I can tell you that teens don't have the same physical activity patterns as children, and they don't have the same physical activity patterns as adults. And so, you know, happy to answer questions when we get to that, that part of the discussion about what my lab does. But needless to say, I think what's important for all of you to just kind of think about is making sure that you do kind of the legwork a priori to determine how you're going to tackle that specific type of issue with this objective measurement. So in conclusion, you know, there are multiple developmental and practical considerations when you're incorporating all of these types of assessments, be it cognitive, self-report, or objective assessments in your research. But don't let that deter you. This is a really important developmental age group to be researched, and you should be involved too. Think through the information that you want and can obtain from this particular sample. And I think if you really ask yourself why you want to include adolescents in your research, that will help you as a guide to selecting the measurements that are most appropriate for you. And just remember, reach out and get help. Team science helps everyone. It's important to have collaborators, and there's folks like Dr. Vanatta and myself that are here willing to help. And there's others out there as well. So once again, don't let that deter you. So thank you so much for your time. Here's Dr. Vanatta's my email in case you ever want to reach out and ask us any questions, and appreciate your time and attention today. Thank you.